was a paternity prank. Also, the Pope decided today to release Vatican-related bath products. An incredible thing. Yes, it's the new Pope on a rope. It's right, Pope on a rope. Wash with it, go straight to heaven. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach, and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues. And today we are going to ask the question, why do people do that which they do when they do that which they do? Why do you make the decisions that you make? Why do the people in your lives make the decisions that they make? Why do people live in just constant friction with one another? Why are there wars? Why are there political debates? Why are there philosophical debates? Why are there religious differences? And today we're going to answer all of those questions with one simple answer. Hold on right there. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to ask this question, like, why do people live the way that they do? And how shall we then live? And in order to do so, I want to piggyback off of probably the best individual who has ever tried to answer this question, namely the late Francis Schaeffer. And I have one of his volumes here, and this is his complete works. And what he tries to do is he tries to set out this concept of what do we mean by a worldview, a way that a person looks at life and the different things that they need to do in order to look at life. And you know, this is a buzzword that a lot of people try to discuss and interact with. And what a worldview tries to do is answer these big questions. The question of origin. Where did we come from? The question of identity. Who are we? The question of morality. How shall we live? And the question of destiny. Where are we going after we die? The way a person answers each of these types of questions starts to reveal the basic ways in which they look at life. And we could ultimately say the reason that people act the way that they do, or they do that which they do, or live the way that they live, or the reason a person has their different political, philosophical, religious, scientific reasons and differences is all because of their worldview. So let's just look at this for 1 second. Let's just picture two big ways that a person could answer these different questions. And let's just call it sort of the secularist or maybe the atheistic worldview versus the Christian worldview. So if we're going to look at the question of origin, we understand that the Christian is going to say we were created by God, whereas maybe somebody who is an atheist would say we were, the byproducts of random chance and evolution. And then you're going to ask, who then are we? What's the question of identity? A Christian's going to say, I am made in the image of God, whereas a person who's going to come from an atheistic worldview, they might have a variety of different answers. Maybe we're the highest political animal, maybe we're the highest evolved animal. But the point is that you can't be made in the image of God without an actual God. Now, the other thing that I want you to see is that these two issues radically affect the way that we understand how we should live. The question of morality, according to whose standard? For the Christian, we realize that God has given us the natural law and he's revealed what he requires of man in his word. So how should we live? We live according to the word of God. We live according to the deeds of Christ in that regard. But then if you ask yourself, if there's nothing above us, if it's all particulars, if it's all these things here and now, then how shall we live? And there's been a variety of different answers. Some atheists still give us this idea that, you should live according to this moral ought, this moral good. And we ask, where does it come from? Others are going to say, no, it's simply a matter of will to power. Whoever's the strongest, the brightest, and in power that day, that's the person who should rule. So we have to ask the question, which one seems to explain life better? And finally, where are we going? What's our destiny? For the Christian, it's death and resurrection and living in the eternal fellowship of God in heaven on earth. For many secularists and atheists, when you're dead, you're dead. When you're gone, you're gone. There's nothing beyond the grave here. So do we see how these two different views, these two different things can radically affect the way a person makes their life decisions? The way that an individual is going to choose something or not choose something, the way that they're going to try to preserve something in society or not preserve something in society, the way that they're going to try to help people or their politics, or all of these different things are all governed according to their worldview. Now, at some point in time, we're going to go through all the different worldviews. But for today, I want to return to this whole issue of why do we do that which we do? And the answer is it's our worldview. Now, what I want to do is I want to piggyback off of Francis Schaeffer, and I want us to see how Schaeffer attempts to answer this question. And I want to go a lot deeper by looking at his book here that we're going to pull up. How should we then live? Now, the beautiful thing about this is that with Schaeffer, there's both a video series and the book. And right now, I'm actually taking a group of people through both the book and the video series. And I thought what he presents here will help many of you out. And if you find this helpful, please like and subscribe to this because I want to know what you want me to make. And hopefully you like this. So Francis Schaeffer is looking at this question. How should we then live? And notice what he says here. This is in the opening chapter of the book. He says, there's a flow to history and culture. We realize this. We don't believe the same things in every era. And he says that this flow is rooted and has its well springs in the thoughts of people. He says people are unique in the inner life of the mind. What they are in their thought world determines how they act. So think about what he's trying to say there. This flow of history. Why you see, we're not living in the 1950s anymore. We've evolved. We've changed. Well, that comes to the way a person thinks about the world. People think different about the world, but notice what he says. This inner thought of the mind, how you think, goes on to say, determines how you will act. So why do people do that which they do? Well, it's all based off of the fact that how a man thinketh, so shall he do, or does in that regard. So let's continue looking at this. He says, this is true of their value systems, and it is true of their creativity. It is true of their corporate actions, such as political decisions, and it's true of their personal lives. So the point is, how a person thinks encompasses every aspect of a person's life. It affects their finances. It affects their politics. It affects their religion. It affects their family. It affects their business. It affects everything. So what's the result? He says the result of their thought world flow through their fingers or through their tongues into the external world. So notice, he's saying that the results of the way that this thought world flows and works, it manifests itself in the way that we live our lives. It manifests itself in our art and in our writings. And he gives this example. He says, this is true of Michelangelo's chisel, and it is true of the dictator's sword. So just consider that for a second. The worldview issue, the question of how a person's going to live, their actions are really just the effect. It's the external fruit of a person's thought life. And notice what he says. This is true of Michelangelo's chisel, in which he's making these great works of art. But it also explains some of the most evil, malevolent dictators in the history of the world. Why? They do that which they do because of the way that they think. So what I want you to look at is that as you're trying to explain your life and the lives of those around you, people do what they do because of their thought life. And this could be another way of saying their world view. Now, it's interesting because it's hard to explain that in English, whereas we have the German term Weltanschauung. And what it is worldview or view of life or view of the world in this sense. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to explain that as a person's thought life is manifesting, it affects the way that they interact in all these different levels. Now let's continue. Stick with me here. I want to transition back into this evaluation, and I want us to look at the next thing that he said here. Schaeffer says this: people have presuppositions, and they will live more consistently on the basis of these presuppositions than even they themselves may realize. You ever think about that? People have presuppositions. People have these things, and he says by presuppositions, we mean the basic way an individual looks at life, his basic worldview, the grid through which he sees the world. So these basic ways that a person is looking at life, these presuppositions, and we live consistently by them. It's the idea of don't ask a person what they claim to believe, look at what they're actually doing. Well, these are the manifestations of their presuppositions, which is a manifestation of their world view. And he says it's the grid through which a person sees the world. Now, there's a lot of Christians and people that will squabble over the concept of worldview and where worldview comes from. And I understand that. And in many ways, I side with some of that debate with it. But what I want you to see is that each person does have a way in which they look at things. And these things determine so much of their policy decisions and their life decisions. Notice what Schaeffer says. He says, presuppositions rest upon that which a person considers to be the truth of which exists. People's presuppositions lay a grid for all they bring forth into the external world. And he finishes with, their presuppositions also provide the basis for their values and therefore the basis for their decisions. So notice what he's trying to say here. Listen to this. Presuppositions rest upon that which the person considers to be true. So what you fundamentally believe to be true is going to reflect itself, as he says here, in that which you bring forth into the external world. So very practically speaking, why do we have this war of worldviews in the West? Well, it's because there's a war of what we think is actually true. Now, there's another aspect of this is that some people are over the war of truth by saying there is no truth. This may be a postmodernist, but the point is that even the postmodernists, whether they can believe it or not, and maybe we can look at other issues related to it, they live as though that presupposition is true or that worldview is true. The question is whether they live according to it consistently, which is something we're going to look at. Stick with me because I want to put this all together at the very end with this idea of what does it mean to take the roof off of somebody, off of their worldview. So notice this. Schaeffer continues by saying, this is the grid by which you bring it forth. It's that by which you bring forth the value systems of life. So again, you have two siblings raised in the same house. Sometimes they pick it up, sometimes they don't. Many times they do. But ultimately, the major difference between two people in today's world is their worldview. So let's keep going here. Let's look at the next one. So Schaeffer goes on to say this, and he gives this very profound thing. He says, as a man thinketh, so he is. We've all heard that. And he says, it's really most profound. You ever think how profound that concept really is? You know, you wonder why you're making the life choices that you're doing. Well, it's all based off of the way that you think. And in many ways, if you can clean up your thinking or become consistent in your thinking, you can clean up a lot of your life. And he says this, an individual is not just the product of forces around him. He has a mind, an inner world. So think about it. You're not just the product of your own circumstances. You're not just the product of bad fortune. Many times you're the product of your thought world. He says, then having thought, a person can bring forth actions into the external world and thus influence it. You can reject the things that are around you. You can positively influence them, but a person can also negatively influence them. And he says this, people are apt to look at the outer theater of action, all these things that are going on out here, forgetting the actor who lives in the mind and who therefore is the true actor of the external world. The inner thought world determines the outward action. So notice this, we're not just the random byproduct of external material forces. We are people with minds who make real decisions and live in a real world. Now, I fully believe in what's known as the fallenness of the human will and the human mind, or this idea of how sin can affect the ways that we think and the decisions that a person brings forth from their heart. Clearly, a good tree brings forth good fruit and a bad tree brings forth bad fruit. And what we find is that the beauty of the Christian worldview is that it's giving us not just the thoughts that we have, but it's the thoughts that God has about the world, and he's revealed them to us in his word. So the question that Schaeffer would look at is he there? And we know that he is there, but is he silent? And if God is both there and he has spoken where? Spoken in his word, then we have a means of giving us a consistent worldview that's in keeping with the God of all creation. You might be saying, well, that begs the question in favor of the Christian worldview. Yes, it does. In yours, don't act like you don't have presuppositions, begs the question in light of your worldview. So I think we can both prove that, the Christian worldview is true, and we can show that people's other worldviews or other individuals' worldviews are inconsistent. And we're going to look at that. Again, I said we're going to look at this idea of taking the roof off of a person's worldview. So let's continue here. Schaeffer says this: most people catch their presuppositions from their family and surrounding society, the way that a child catches measles. We see that. That person thinks that because they were raised in that home, or that person thinks that because they were raised there. There's some truth to that. Now, there are mavericks to the system, but there is an element of truth. But he says this: but people with more understanding realize that their presuppositions should be chosen after a careful consideration of what worldview is true. When all is done, when all the alternatives have been explored, not many men are in the room. That is, although worldviews have many variations, there are not many basic worldviews or basic presuppositions. Stick with me here. He says this: these basic options will become obvious as we look at the flow of the past. So notice what he says. You have a group of people out there who are very conscious about the study of worldview. But the vast majority, in fact, I would say the overwhelming majority of people, they just live their lives going on here or there, and they're never really reflective upon it. And notice what he says. He's giving us this concept here when he says, when all is said and done and all the alternatives have been explored, there are not many men in the room, or many women, or many adults, whatever we want to use here today, because people don't take the hard work and hard effort to ask, is that which I believe, is that which I hold most dear actually true? So the question that I ask is this: which one do you hold to? Which person are you? Are you a person who is conscious of the inner thought world, or are you just live and let live? Because if you are, yeah, you're kind of in control of yourself, but you're not really in control of yourself. You will live a much better life if you're conscious of the worldview that you hold to. Now, some people, even non-Christians, are very conscious of the worldview that they hold to. But I would say if you are a Christian, or you are a person who claims to be a Christian, you need to do the hard work. Take the time, take the effort, and ask yourself, why do I believe what I claim that I believe? And then ask the second question: am I consistent in the way that I live with the worldview that I claim to believe? If not, we've got some serious issues. Now, I want to say this on a very practical level. All Christians are going to say things like, I know what I believe, and I know how I should live in light of what I believe, but I fall short. And that's where the Christian worldview provides such a wonderful answer. We have a Savior. We have a substitute. We have the righteousness of God in Christ that stands in our place. And that's why we turn to Christ and we hold forth to Christ, knowing that we fail in so many respects. But let's keep going here to this last little slide here. Notice what Schaeffer says. He says, to understand where we are in today's world. So why mom does what she does, and why the guy at work does what he does, and why the corporations do what they do, and why the politics is. He says this: where we are in today's world, in our intellectual ideas and in our cultural and political lives, we must trace three lines in history, namely the philosophic, the scientific, and the religious. If you look at how philosophy operates, how science operates, and how religion operates, in those three spheres, and that almost triangulation of things, you can understand the major ebb and flow of why things happened in the past and why things are the way they are today. And notice what he says here. He says, the philosophic seeks intellectual answers to the basic questions of life. Who am I? How shall I live? Is there a God? What is humanity? And so on and so forth. He says the scientific has two parts. First, the makeup of the physical universe. It tries to study the makeup of the world in which we live. But notice this. And then the practical applications of what it discovers in technology. The direction in which science will move is set by the philosophical worldview of the scientists. And finally, he says people's religious views also determine the direction of their individual lives and of their society. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of people act like science in and of itself is the sole standard of all things. We have to say that. Science in and of itself, because that's a fun way to say it. But what I want you to see here is that science, if we've learned anything over the last several years, is incredibly theory-laden. You have science, but then you also have scientists. You have people who bring their philosophical worldviews to the data, to the situations. And we've realized this. Since 2020, in all of Joe's cookie mandates, we have to say it that way, lest our particular people here that are sponsoring this video don't like it and like to take us down. And we know what we're talking about here. We realized what went on was a major clash of worldviews. Why were people so scared? Why were people so anxious? Why were people struggling with so many different things? It was because of their philosophical worldviews and their religious worldviews and the way that science or $ for an S, science, operate. The point that he's trying to get at is that all of these things determine the direction an individual takes with their thought life and the flow of history. So in order to understand that which you believe, you got to be a student of history. How then shall we live, or how should we then live? Schaeffer in this book traces that, and I would encourage you to read this. But note, I said we were going to answer one final thing. What does it mean to take the roof off of somebody? So we all know what a house is. A house has a good foundation, walls, and a roof. And when you're looking at the concept of a worldview, we realize that a worldview can be exposed. And we realize that you can show the total futility of something by showing massive inconsistencies with it. So for example, let's just say I lived according to a worldview that says that stealing is okay and hurting another individual is okay, and there's really nothing you can do about it. So I'm this individual, and let's just say I decide to go to a bar that night, and I'm at the bar and I'm drinking beer and I'm doing this, and all of a sudden I get pushed from behind, I get socked in the face, and somebody steals my wallet and runs directly out to the parking lot down the road, and they're gone. And I yell out immediately, "Get the police, call the police on that man. I have been hit. He stole my wallet. I want my stuff back, and I want that man brought to justice." Well, here's the issue with it, is that according to your worldview, there's nothing wrong with, matter in motion or molecules reacting against one another. There is no sort of moral law above you. So really what you have is just an icky preference that you don't like. But the way that you've reacted shows that you don't really believe that matter in motion has no moral impetus and that justice shouldn't be done. So the point is that when a person finally sees that, the roof has been taken off of their worldview, and you can look right in and see how dirty and how messy and how inconsistent it can be. But this is where the Christian worldview comes in, is that the Christian worldview can explain these kinds of things. You're made in the image of God. You've got the morality of God written upon your heart. You've got a conscience. You've got a moral law that's out there. You've got God's word that, not only reflects the moral law, but it expresses it directly in propositions. So you don't just go around and rob people, beat people, take their money and expect no justice. God has given us justice. God has given us morality, and God has given us a world in which we function and live. And that individual, whether they know it or not, is borrowing off of the capital of the Christian worldview. So what do we need to do? What do we need to do in these types of situations? We got to help them put a new roof on. When the roof has been exposed, it's one of the most dangerous times of their life. And that's why when the Christian exposes it, you must be so careful lest they lead an utter abyss. You must be so cautious and so gracious to help put the Christian roof on, the Christian worldview. So with that said, why do people do that which they do? Well, as a man, as Schaeffer says, as a man thinketh, so he is. So why do people do all the crazy things that they do? Because of their worldview. So again, if you like this, please like and subscribe, grab Schaeffer's book, continue watching. I appreciate you and so much more. Thank you.
You like me because of my sister.
Oh, I like you because you're honest. Because you're shorter than him. You look like a before and after picture. Now, come on.
Monkey boy.